Okay, good morning, everybody. Welcome to Feminism, UBI, and the Politics of Caring Labor. My name is Monica Viktorova. I'm one of NABIG's organizers, and I'll be your moderator today. Before we get started, I'd like to give a brief overview on how to use Crowdcast. If you'd like to submit a question to the speakers, please post it in the Ask a Question section down below. You can also vote on questions already posted by the other attendees. This is going to help us determine which questions to prioritize. Next, there's a chat box where you can hold side conversations. This is where we will post any links and supplemental information during the session. In order to keep things moving, we might not get around to responding to all of the activity in the chat, so please be sure to submit any questions using the Ask a Question function. I'd like to give a really warm welcome to our panel speakers today. Anka Geush is a political philosopher interested in justice, and in particular gender justice and justice towards children. Anka co-edited the Routledge Handbook of the Philosophy of Childhood and Children and published 2 pieces on the feminist case for and against UBI. The most recent of these is the feminist argument against supporting care in the Journal of Practical Ethics. John Walker is a student of economics at MIT with an interest in applications of econometrics to social problems, including poverty and inequality. They volunteer their time as a research assistant with the UBI Center, looking at the socioeconomic and distributional impacts of cash transfers, with a particular interest in child outcomes. They're currently investigating the behavior of instrumental variable estimators used to estimate stochastic coefficients in structural equation models. They have previously worked as a public health researcher and consultant. Serkan Şimşir has a degree at Marmara University, Department of Political Science and Public Administration. He earned his master's degree in political theory at the University of Rennes in 2020. He has studied the following subject matter in his master's thesis: basic income as a tool for the emancipation of women, a potential idea to ensure gender equality guaranteed by the welfare state. Serkan is currently continuing his second master's education in Marmara University's Political and Social Sciences Master's Program, and is looking for a PhD. Today's discussion will be a panel where we will touch on Anka, John, and Serkan's most recent scholarship about UBI feminism and caring labor. We'll explore what caring labor is, why it's central to the fight for gender equality, and how UBI is a powerful policy tool to recognize and enable it. After the paper discussions, we'll delve into some questions and audience Q&A. Please note that we're going to be linking to Serkan, Anka, and John's research in the chat during the session, and I really encourage all of you to open up those papers and have a detailed read after the session. So without further ado, let's get into some of the content. Before we dive into the research, can our panelists maybe help level set our understanding of what caring labor is? And Anka, I might start with you on this one.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for having me here. So I understand caring as the activity of meeting people's needs most generally. And of course, very often this involves labor. So caring labor is labor that one performs in the service of either one's own or more often other people's needs. And I think that of particular social importance is caring labor that serves those needs of other people that they cannot meet themselves.
John, Serkan, did you guys have thoughts that you wanted to add?
Yeah, I might add to that just that often when we talk about the caring equality and caring labor, we're including both paid and unpaid forms of labor. So often, for example, people take on caring roles within the household for family members, but they might also take on similar caring roles in sort of a paid employment position. So for example, we might call childcare paid labor if you say work in a facility which provides childcare to many children. We might call it unpaid caring labor if it's provision of childcare, say, to your own children.
Thank you. Serkan, did you want to add anything else on the topic of what caring labor is to help situate our audience?
Actually, no, it was very good definition. So
awesome, sounds good. So because caring labor is often uncompensated, as we've mentioned, and it's performed in the home and is also disproportionately done by women, a variety of policies have been proposed to help economically value it. And UBI is one of these policies. So I wanted to actually turn to Serkan. In your paper, you discuss the politics of caring labor in UBI, and you conclude that a carefully calculated basic income can help close the gender gap if it's implemented with other well-functioning welfare state policies. So, oh, I see that we're waiting for him to reconnect. Oh, did we just lose him? You might have just lost him. Okay, maybe we'll give him a second to reconnect. And in the meantime, Anka, maybe I'll go right to you. In your recent paper, The Feminist Argument Against Supporting Care, you make the argument that policies that support those who provide caring labor, like child welfare and UBI, are sometimes presented as unfeminist because they may pull women out of the formal workforce. Did you want to tell us a little bit more about your research?
Yeah, sure. So as you said, some of my work is about the gender division of labor, that is women's specialization in hands-on care that we all need at different periods of our lives. The gender division of labor, I think, explains to quite a large extent not only the gender pay gap, but also the feminization of poverty and the private domination to which many women are being subjected. So this means that no surprise that feminists have two distinct aims, at least feminism as I see it. One is to protect women from the risks of being a caregiver. The other one is to do away with the gender division of labor itself, which is the main source of the problem. So I'm one of these feminists. I would like to see women and men equally engaged in both caregiving to children and to other people in need of care and in the labor market. So one thing that we can do, amongst other things, to prevent women's dependency and poverty is to introduce a universal basic income. Another one is, of course, to introduce child benefits. But there is a problem with these policies, as well as with other policies that feminists have proposed in order to lighten the burden of care on women. Namely, cash transfers give their recipients incentives to stay out of work. And since most men will not rush to be the primary caregivers of their kids, cash transfers are going to mostly keep women out of the labor market. I mean, to an even greater extent, they already are. So for economic reasons, employers are already more reluctant to hire people of parenting age in positions where staff turnover is costly, and mostly women of parenting age. And so since it's women who are usually availing themselves of leave periods, flexibility, and part-time work, it also means that it's them rather than men of the same age who are primary victims of this sort of statistical discrimination. Now, compensating the disadvantage that women incur as a result of the gender division of labor also encourage them to carry on with care work. So the worry is that with a universal basic income in place, women will be even more likely to be primary caregivers. And therefore, the UBI will risk to amplify the reason for statistical discrimination and therefore to entrench even deeper the very cause of the disadvantage, the gender division of labor. And this is why some feminists have criticized UBI as unintentionally widening the gap between women's and men's participation in the labor market. And I'm one of those feminists. I've written something to this conclusion along these lines in the past. But now I think that this criticism, which in itself is valid, nevertheless backfires against the worst of women. So this means that a universal basic income would mostly benefit the worst of women, those who don't have jobs or who have always been unemployed or precariously employed, or else employed in terrible jobs of the kind that are not usually affected by statistical discrimination. And to oppose the UBI in order to protect the labor opportunities of the well-off women, then, is to fail to attend to the interests of the worse-off women. So I conclude in the paper that you have mentioned that feminists with egalitarian commitments should, all things considered, support UBI. So this is to say that we should pursue the two distinct feminist aims in the right order. You remember the feminist aims were to alleviate the burden of care on women and also to do away with the gender division of labor. I think the right order for pursuing these aims is to give priority to protecting women from the worst consequences of the gender division of labor over the abolition of the gender division of labor itself. Moreover, I think we should be aware that there is an unavoidable tension between the two aims, and to keep this tension in mind when we advocate for particular policies, not to do this advocacy too naively.
Awesome. Thank you, Anka. Oh, I think you might be on mute.
Yeah, I was just saying that something is wrong with my voice. I apologize for that.
No worries. Thank you so much for sharing that. I wanted to actually move over to Serkan and kind of ask him to weigh in on the discussion. So, Serkan, in your paper, you discuss the politics of caring labor in UBI, and you conclude similarly that a carefully calculated basic income can help close the gender gap, especially if it's implemented alongside other functioning welfare state policies. Did you want to tell us a little bit more about your research? Oh, you're on mute. Oh, Serkan, we can't hear you because you're on mute. Oh, you should be good.
Monica. So first of all, I would like to thank the committee for organizing this Congress, which allowed us to listen to various ideas about the basic income. So the title of my paper is Gender, Social Equality and Basic Income. As Monica said, I examined in my paper the possible contribution of a basic income to recognition of caring labor in the light of feminist arguments. Actually, inequality and the fight against inequality are generally considered with household incomes. This leads to ignoring the inequalities within the household, especially the inequal position of women in gender relations. The distribution of responsibilities within the household is thought to be the main cause of most gender inequalities. The idea that every individual should have a minimum income is important in this respect. In feminist debate on basic income, the question how the state can recognize unpaid work, which is largely carried out by women, without reinforcing existing inequalities between women and men, comes to the fore. Actually, the limited feminist literature on basic income reflects a dichotomy. One part of the literature draws attention to its potential to ensure at least a basis of emancipation for women. On the other hand, the other part of literature is skeptical, as they believe that an introduction of a basic income would exacerbate existing gender inequalities. As a result, it turns out that a basic income will have both positive and negative effects on women. First, for some researchers, basic income will contribute to the recognition of the value of women's unpaid work. They claim that the most important contribution of basic income to women's life will be in this area. As basic income advocates point out, family members depend on unpaid work performed primarily by women in their family, especially in traditional families. In this context, basic income can encourage those who do not perform their responsibilities with the family to do these duties and thus become a tool for recognizing women's domestic contributions, because they would have a basic economic security through this basic income and their bargaining power within the household increases. Some academics argue that an implementation of basic income can contribute also to the revaluation of unpaid care work by recognition the non-market structure of this work. Because with promoting the financial revaluation and recognition of unpaid work, a basic income can help increase the population's respect for this work, especially men's respect for this work. So according to feminist advocates, we can make the assumption that in a welfare state that includes a basic income, the value of reproductive labor will be mechanically recognized. In conclusion, it is argued that basic income is an important policy to reduce the sexual division of labor in the household for a more egalitarian society. In this way, the basic income expands the freedom of women. On the other hand, in the arguments put forward by opponents of basic income, we observe the idea that basic income can cause the disassociation of women from employment, and for this reason, such a proposal can turn into housewife wage, maternity pay, or hush money, because basic income may encourage women to stay home for childcare and housework. This can cause childcare or poverty trap for women. The demand for a basic income disassociated from employment causes as many problems as it opens up perspectives. We can assume that the idea of living wage dissociated from employment leads some feminists to take a stand against basic income. Finally, it will have a negative effect on those women who would withdraw from the labor market, as they could suffer a depreciation of their human capital, and in this way, they could lose the non-pecuniary benefits of paid work. In the argument put forward by opponents of basic income, we also observe the idea that with the introduction of a basic income, some women undoubtedly reduce their labor supply, and they will be less attached to the labor market. This could worsen the statistical discrimination against women. In this regard, some feminists note that the establishment of a basic income could become an instrument to the detriment of women. In conclusion, such a proposal, which applauds its potential to emancipate women from the gender-based construction of the labor market and society, may paradoxically worsen women's condition by disassociating them from employment and by decreasing their participation in the labor market. At the end of my paper, I argue that basic income can be proposed as a policy that can help to close the gender gap if the amount paid of basic income is carefully calculated and implemented in conjunction with other well-functioning welfare state policies. Because if the level of basic income is high, it can really encourage people to not work regardless of man or woman. And if basic income replaces all other social policies, it does more harm than good, because in this case, basic income becomes a compensation for these social policies. But I conclude by claiming that a basic income that is well planned and that takes into account these potential dangers can be an effective policy to help reduce gender inequalities in the household. Thank you for your attention.
Questions, but before that, I want to invite John to share with us his research. John and their colleagues at the UBI Center have looked at how cash transfers given for every child as a universal child allowance are an incredibly powerful tool to reduce poverty, child poverty, and potentially inequality. So John, would you like to share a little bit about your research?
Sure. Can you see my screen?
Yes, we can.
Awesome. So my colleagues on the panel have described the value of a UBI as a tool in improving the lives of carers, and particularly women. In my presentation, I'll be looking at competing child targeting policies, and specifically why a universal child allowance is a better policy instrument for reducing poverty and inequality compared to the provision of free childcare. I co-authored this paper with Max Genis, who I think is also around to answer your questions, and we were supported in producing the research by Ben Burlett, who's a research assistant at the UBI Center. So, what's the background? So given things like COVID-19, which has closed schools and taken away one of the primary sources of childcare for parents, and given a rising political debate on child targeting interventions, like Biden's expansion of the child tax credit, this has become quite a pertinent issue in sort of the social debate of how we should intervene to reduce child poverty and poverty of the household through targeting families with children. The current set of support measures available to families is quite complex. For example, there are things like the Child Independent childcare tax credit, there's a dependent flexible spending account tax exemption. The measures are quite complex, but there's quite a broad system already in place. Our research question is, in this context, what are the impacts of the provision of childcare and of a child allowance of equal costs on poverty and inequality? Which one performs better? Which one should we probably intervene with? So, data. We use two sources of data to investigate this question. Is my slide changing? It is, there we go. So we use two sources of data. The first is the current population survey, so census data, which we aggregate over the period 2018 to 2020. And from that, we draw things like childcare expenditures and demographic characteristics of the household, as well as most importantly, their income and whether or not they're below the poverty line. We also use data from the Center for American Progress, and they estimate the cost of provision of childcare in a given state for a child of a given age. And we use those to project what we think the expected cost of childcare would be under various simulations. So what did we do in this paper? In our paper, we simulate out three distinct scenarios. In the first, we replace the childcare expenses of the households. There we go. Sorry, it's a bit slow to change the slides. We simulate three distinct scenarios. In the first, we replace the childcare expenses of households, assuming no new take-up, and comparing it to a budget equivalent child allowance that varies in child age. In the second and third, we either provide households the estimated cost of childcare provided by that CAP data I talked about, or we similarly provide them an equivalent cost childcare allowance. In that case, we assume full take-up. The difference between the second and the third scenario shown in that table is just that we've assumed different costs of the program. So either we assume base quality, which is sort of the minimum quality of childcare to meet state legislative requirements, or we assume high quality childcare, which instead sort of meets the requirements recommended by professionals. It's sort of the level of childcare I would hope to provide to my own child. Importantly, the costs of each program differ quite markedly, as you'll see in that table below. So we can't compare between the different scenarios, merely compare within them. So what are our results? Probably our headline result is about the poverty impact by scenario. So the impact on the poverty rate. And hopefully my slide will change in a second. Fingers crossed. There we go. So in our first scenario, we see much larger impacts associated with the provision of child allowance compared to the provision of childcare. So that's sort of the first two bars on the far left of the graphic. Importantly, the child allowance is associated with a 6% reduction in poverty from a baseline of 13%, so quite a significant amount, compared to roughly 2% in the childcare provision scenario. We see across the other simulations, much larger impacts associated with a much larger program cost. But importantly, the difference in the impact of each type of policy, so whether we provide childcare or whether we provide, I'm sorry, I was just reading the chat. It's not about mine, it's a different person's video. So it's the difference between the two types of interventions becomes a lot smaller. And this is likely due to the fact that we're here restricting the take-up rate. We're assuming that everybody takes up this program. And we also assume that the only differences between the cost of the household of childcare are based on the child age and differences in state-based cost and childcare provision. And here we actually have very similar results that we see for deep poverty. So I won't present them, but let's assume that they're very similar. So in general, the child allowance performs slightly better. And in our first simulation, where we consider take-up to be very important, it performs much better. I'll briefly consider some other results. A really important one is on child poverty. So it turns out that each of the simulations and different types of programs that we consider do a very good job of reducing child poverty. And hopefully my slide will reflect that in a second. The reductions for the replacement of childcare, so the provision of free childcare, are about 7% roughly, whereas if we provided a child allowance instead, it would be around 23%. So a fair bit larger for the child allowance, but quite significant across both. Importantly, the differences are much, much larger when we look at our base quality and high quality provision of childcare. And again, that's sort of associated with the size of the investment in the program. It turns out if we spend quite a bit of money on these kind of programs, there's a very significant reduction in child poverty. There are quite similar results on the Gini coefficient. So it turns out that a child allowance reduces the Gini coefficient substantially more than the provision of childcare. And in fact, that result is quite stable across all of our different scenarios. So it turns out there is quite a substantial difference no matter what kind of simulation and assumptions we make. Finally, I wanted to show you guys a quick graph because it's cool. We'll see if it pops up in a second. But basically what it shows is there is state heterogeneity in the impact of a child allowance compared to the provision of childcare. So it turns out that depending on which state you live in and depending on the childcare costs within that state, the impact of the provision of either a child allowance or instead of provision of childcare differs quite markedly. And that makes sense given that the costs are quite different. In general, though, we find that the relative impacts under the child allowance are substantially better across all states. So our primary conclusion is that across each of our simulations, a child allowance performed as well or better in cost effectiveness terms as a tool in reducing poverty and inequality. And we sort of have some areas that we think should be researched in the future. The first is that our primary study limitation is that we don't really talk about dynamic effects. So we don't talk about the labour supply decisions of women, which probably would change in response to such a large transfer. And we don't talk about the elasticity of the childcare expenditure. So that would also be worth investigating. We would also hope that soon people will engage in modelling a child allowance, which is being proposed, for example, by Biden. So here we've sort of done some hypothetical different types of child allowances, but we'd hope that we could give it very specifically to a policy in the future to analyse how well that performs. Thank you.
Thank you, John. Some really, really interesting and thought-provoking research there. So I wanted to actually jump into the question portion of the program. I wanted to kind of come back to some of what Anka and Serkan were talking about. So both Anka and Serkan sort of talked about this idea that we want to try to value caring labor, value what it means to actually take care of another person. And Serkan, I believe you mentioned that providing UBI can sort of level the playing field and actually increase the respect for caring labor, because in our society we tend to show value by actually paying for something. So obviously, like we pay for labor, having UBI as a sort of remuneration for caring labor would be really, really important to increase that respect. So the question that I kind of wanted to ask, and Anka and Serkan, please feel free to kind of both chime in on this, is what are some of the incentives that you might think about around UBI to actually help incentivize that behavior, both from women and from men, to value that caring labor?
I can respond if you want, because I don't see Anka is here. So I think that recognition of caring labor is very important because, like I said, it can be increase the respect of population to this work, and it be increase the participation of men to these responsibilities, because as I mentioned while I presented my paper for feminist, the percentage equity of household responsibilities is very important. But in our society, we observe that there are actually women who do these works because of that. I think if basic income can encourage men to do these responsibilities, it will be a good contribution, and maybe men can be more attached to caring labor. I think like this.
Thank you, Serkan. And I see that Anka has joined us again. Hi, Anka. So maybe to follow up on this, and I wanted to actually pull in a question from the audience that C has asked. Is there a more effective policy to value unpaid care work that wouldn't have the effect of encouraging women to exit the labor market? And I think maybe I would follow that up to say, you know, do we care about women exiting the labor market as long as perhaps, in fact, both women and men and people of all genders are kind of exiting the labor market at equal rates? So I guess that would kind of be like my follow up to that question. But yes, Anka and Serkan, and also John, if you have thoughts, please feel free. Oh, Anka, I think you're on mute. Let me unmute you. I think there's a little bit of connectivity issues. So maybe we'll give Anka a chance to reconnect in that case, and maybe actually move to a question that touches a little bit on your research, John. Is there any research out there about people's life satisfaction having received caregiver allowance, regardless of the fact that they're no longer attached to the labor market?
Interesting. Honestly, I'm not entirely sure, and maybe I'll throw to Max to see if he knows anything about that research. But I think the question poses something which is quite important here, which is that maybe we should be concerned about labour supply effects on women, and we might be concerned that women are disproportionately leaving the workforce to take on caregiver roles. But I think to some extent, at least I, as a third wave feminist, embrace the empowerment of women in having the choice to opt into the sort of lifestyle that they prefer for themselves. So maybe to some extent that's very much shaped by patriarchal norms, which determine how they may want to live their lives, and maybe we shouldn't embrace those norms. But I think we should, to the greatest extent possible, empower women to make the choice which most allows them to self-actualize and gives them opportunities to live their lives as they wanted to. So maybe we shouldn't be too concerned about having exact parity in how many men and women leave the labour force, as long as we are quite concerned about those sort of welfare impacts of how women determine whether or not they feel that they have actualized their life in a way which is beneficial to them. So I'm sorry, I'll throw to Max now to see if he knows of any of that research.
I apologize. Could you repeat the question, please?
Yes, absolutely. So the question was, is there any research out there about people's life satisfaction having received the caregiver allowance, regardless of the fact that they're no longer attached to the labor market?
Right. I'm not familiar with any there. I think another piece that touches on it, though, is the child development research. So there's a lot of very strong evidence that children grow up in terms of cognitive and non-cognitive development in a much more healthy way. They have stronger educational outcomes, health outcomes, and long-term, they actually have higher earnings and even lower higher life expectancy if they don't experience poverty as children. And some of that has been tied to more strong familial ties. So I think there is research that child allowances increase the time that parents spend with children. So I think that all points in the direction of, yes, there is very strong satisfaction. And I would also add that the evidence on all those factors is more mixed when it comes to childcare provision. So thank you for adding me. Good to be here.
Awesome. Thanks, Max. And maybe to follow up on that, because I found it quite interesting that your research kind of shows this strong gap in favor of UBI as actually being the better policy outcome for children. What is sort of the link between and maybe, I don't know if you thought about this as you folks were kind of looking at the data, but what is the link between, you know, caregiver outcomes and child the data that you're seeing, since children are doing better in circumstances where their caregivers are actually getting cash as opposed to just getting their childcare paid for.
Yeah, I guess, again, I'm not sure of research on specifically caregiver. I mean, something that was evident from the research that John presented is that kind of mechanically, when you give parents cash, that does reduce child poverty. It also reduces adult poverty. So all the distinguishing sort of quantitative comparisons between childcare and child allowances, that is going to, in general, also reduce adult poverty more directionally. So all the research that applies to children in much smaller doses, but adults are pretty sensitive to being obviously in poverty as well. I think that's why we're all here, is we know the impacts of that. So policies that do that the most cost effectively are, I think, going to improve caregiver outcomes on other dimensions.
Thank you. And I see a follow-up question from Liz. Why do childcare costs vary so much across the states? Is there any consensus on what a reasonable wage is? What is the range, and is wage based on quality of center or on cost of living in the area?
So I'll take that one. Both. So firstly, so the data that we're using to estimate our costs considers both within states, sort of like the cost of housing and therefore the associated cost of the rental market and therefore the cost of provision of childcare given those rental costs. But we're also really interested in what I call the base and the high quality scenario. So whether the provision of childcare sort of meets legislative requirements at the state level, so it's kind of like the minimum required level of childcare, compared to what we would consider like a high quality care is determined by professionals in the industry. And that sort of relates to things like the ratio between how many teachers there are to students. Sorry, teachers is not the correct word. Carers to students in the provision of childcare arrangement. So yeah, there's differentiation across both lines. I might take offline the discussion of costs within individual states because I feel like I'll be presenting too many tables. But perhaps if the questioner wanted to send me an email, I'll be happy to send them some materials.
But just to clarify, so within base and high quality scenarios, the idea is that across states, that's going to vary only with the actual cost of providing that level of childcare. And as John said, that's largely housing costs. And as he alluded to, within California, for example, where I live, like the San Francisco Bay Area, childcare is much more expensive than in the more rural, lower cost areas. And that's not something that we considered, but we hope to.
Thank you, John and Max. The next question from the audience is for Anka, and it says, I understood that you expect the availability of UBI could exacerbate the existing gender division of caring labor. Do you think there are ways that UBI programs could be structured or delivered that would have a greater or less effect in this regard? What can be done about this?
Thank you, and sorry for all the technical issues I've been having. Can you hear me now? Yeah, well, I wish I could say yes, but I don't really know of ways of implementing the UBI which wouldn't have these unintended consequences. But probably if UBI was implemented alongside other kinds of policies, these effects could be contained. So for instance, feminists who are very worried about entrenching the gender division of labor are always very happy about policies which are to some extent externalizing the childcare and other caring duties that usually fall on women. For instance, by having high quality subsidized daycares and after schools and other facilities that look well after children, freeing women to participate in the labor market. Now, the interesting question is what to do if the policy on offer is UBI only, without these kinds of additional policies that could also protect from worsening the gender division of labor, or nothing. And I think this is a difficult choice at least for feminists.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think, my understanding is that some of the reasons for especially the gap that we see with women's earning potential right now is because there is a wage gap between women and men. Often in different sex couples, women will actually take time off because their male partner is earning more money. And so I don't know if UBI might potentially even that a little bit and create at least a little bit of a buffer or a cushion so that it doesn't necessarily always seem like the person who is tending to make less money, which is often women in the relationship, might have to take that time off. But that's a point.
Yeah, that's interesting. So Yeah. So some people I know who have been doing empirical research on caring and on UBI came up with the conclusion that in many families this effect would obtain, namely in families where the main incentive for the women to stay home and look after people in need of care is not so much making as much money as they can, but making ends meet. So if the reason why it's a woman rather than a man who stays off the labor market to care for children is because on her salary the family wouldn't survive, then introducing the UBI may remove this kind of trap and may allow sometimes the male partner to stay home and raise the children. But in couples in which are simply seeking, couples or family arrangements that are seeking to maximize their earnings, as long as women and men tend to earn different amounts of money, I don't think the UBI can do much to change this. Can I just say one thing? My understanding is that much of what is called the gender pay gap is really a pay gap that applies to mothers as opposed to non-mother female and to men who have or don't have children. So it's really that the gender gap is mostly driven by women's caring and especially child caring duties.
Could I just hop in there real quick? Because I think it's an interesting question of, that's absolutely true. And largely that's because we don't compensate home care. It doesn't show up in GDP. When you hire childcare workers, that does show up in GDP, both in the wages that the mother might or parent might earn in the market and also the wages that they pay to the childcare worker. That seems like a flaw with GDP to me. And I think we need to recognize that kind of work as the legitimate work it is. And I think just to put some numbers on this gets to what John started the conversation with. 79% of stay-at-home parents are female. That's a very big skew, but the share of childcare workers who are female is 92%. So I think this illustrates the kind of tension between some of these ideas.
Definitely. Thank you, Max. And I'll move to the next question, which I see that you actually submitted. How do feminist theorists distinguish encouragement of home childcare compared to being empowered to make such a choice? I struggle with the implication that cash forces anyone into any particular choice, which is a very interesting question. I encourage anyone from the panel to jump in.
Can I say something? I don't think the claim is that the cash would be forcing anybody to leave the labor market. And actually, one of the things I wanted to say, but then I lost the Wi-Fi, is that there are two different problems. So one is the problem that people expect that women are going to, in larger numbers or for longer periods of time, stay out of the labor market. But this is not necessarily a problem as long as it's their decision. The other problem is that statistical discrimination is going to also hit against women who don't have any intention to stay out of the labor market. The employer cannot know whether the person they are going to employ or consider employing is a more typical woman who is going to have children and require flexible time or leaves, or is a woman who doesn't have any intention to have children or who has a partner who can look after children. So I think this raises the bigger problem, the way in which the consequences of the UBI and the statistical discrimination that it can entrench may actually work against women who don't want to leave the labor market.
That's a good point, Anka. Did anyone else want to jump in on this question around incentivizing home childcare?
Actually, as I mentioned while presenting my paper, I said that for basic income advocates, basic income can ensure a liberty of choice for women to leave the labor market and do care work or homework. But for opponents, it's not a choice, it's an obligation of coercion. But I argue that if we calculate carefully the basic income and implement it with other functioning welfare policies like childcare policies or other policies, I think that we can use basic income for close the gender gap, especially in household. And I would like to say another thing that for basic income advocates, basic income can increase the bargaining power of women in the labor market, because they argue that basic income can provide an economic security, and because of that, they can choose the works that they want to be here. Because of that, I think basic income may allow them to better demonstrate their abilities. So I don't think that basic income turns into a talent drain for women.
Thank you, Serkan. Appreciate that response. Folks, we are unfortunately at time, but I just wanted to give just a thank you to our fantastic panelists today. Anka, John, Serkan, and Max, thank you so much for contributing your thoughts with us and talking about your research. And to our audience, thank you so much for attending this session. If you'd like to continue the conversation, you can head over to Kumo Space. I know there's still a couple of questions we weren't able to get to, but I really encourage you to head over to Kumo Space during the break. You can hang out. It does really feel like actually socializing in person, which is fascinating for an online environment. If you did enjoy this session, we've got more coming up. So please check out the conference website for the full schedule. The next keynote sessions are the intersectionality of basic income at 2 p.m. Eastern and pilots data and the drive towards cash policies at 6 p.m. Eastern. Thank you so much, everybody. Have a fantastic day.
Thank you.